Jesus. Now, would you turn your attention to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, beginning in verse 27. After this, he, being Jesus, went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And leaving everything, he rose and followed him. And Levi made him a great feast in his house, and there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at a table with them. And when the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus answered them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." This is the word of the Lord. You can have a seat. Many are the ways in which God is seeking to make himself known to us and to bring us into communion with him. These are the words written by the Methodist preacher and teacher Ellen White in 1892 in her book, Steps to Christ. A reminder for us that God is calling us to know him, and the God that is calling us to know him and find him has made himself findable. The question for us is, what do we experience when we find Jesus? Do we experience his condemnation? Do we experience a Jesus who just begins to berate us for the decisions we have made in life or the situations we have found ourselves in? Or perhaps the Jesus we find is the one who celebrates all of our choices and is otherwise good with anything we have done as long as we just make him some part of our lives? Or do we find a Jesus who invites us into communion with him, to walk in intimacy with him? And the scriptures would tell us that this is the Jesus that we find, the kind of Jesus who in John 15 says, "Abide in me, remain in me, stay with me, all of you, not just some of you, abide in me, and as you abide in me, you will experience the intimacy that I have with the Father, and what the Father has with the Spirit, and the Spirit has with me. You will be invited into this life of communion with Jesus." And if we are to find Jesus, and if we are to experience the communion he has for us and with us, the question that we have to ask is, where do we look, or where should we find this Jesus that we might have this communion with him? And I want to teach you something today that is rather obvious. In fact, I was telling some of the pastors in the prayer team, I almost feel as though there should be something more in this text. I sometimes love to dig into the text and find the richness and the gold that is hidden deep within. And today, friends, is not one. It's right there on the surface. Where do you find Jesus? It's there in plain writing, according to the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is found at the table of fellowship. He's found at the table of fellowship. When we think of table, we think of food and meals, and for most all of us, meals and food and table play some significant role in our lives. Those places in our lives where the table is set has a particular meaning for us. It draws us into imagery and stories. I think of the British journalist and writer Nigel Slater. In his autobiography, he says that his mother's kisses were like marshmallows. Sadly and tragically, his mother died at the age of 9, and every day for the rest of his life and his childhood, his father on his bed every night would leave a little marshmallow, a reminder of his mother's love, setting a table for him right there on that pillow. When we think of tables today, we might think of family and the table of our adolescence and how it was set and how we ate. Maybe some of you, they were epic grand meals every night. Maybe for others, it was boxed macaroni and cheese. That's the best that they could come up with, but they bring the stories of your childhood. If you are a parent right now with little children, you know both the table is beautiful and brutal at the same time. Trying to convince your children to just eat what's been put in front of them. And inevitably you realize that you are using the same tactics that were used on you that didn't work. So I have my 8-year-old and I'm trying to get him to eat the broccoli and he won't eat the broccoli. And I tell him, Eli, there's children all over the world who have nothing to eat. You should eat your broccoli. And then he asks what is the most obvious question. Well, Dad, how is me eating this broccoli helping them? It doesn't. That's not the point, Eli. The point is my parents used that technique and now I'm using that technique and one day you will use that technique. Some of you know what table means when you first go to school. When I was in high school, students coming up, where you sat in the cafeteria, that would dictate your future. Not what you studied, not how good your grades were, where you sat at the table. There was a movie called Mean Girls that came out, and everyone who grew up then understood the necessity of finding the right table. You don't want to be at the wrong table. Trust me, you can't get out of that table. Some of us, when we think of tables, we think of fond memories of friendship and family. And for others, when we think of table, we think of the brokenness and the loneliness it represents. The father who was supposed to be there but was never there. The parents who were altogether too busy to set the table and to create an atmosphere of love and belonging. You might look at the table now and be thinking, I'm longing for the day where I don't have to sit in this cheap apartment that is way overpriced, eating this food at this table that I got at the drive-thru. I am longing for a family to be here with the noise of that family. We know tables. We live at tables. Jesus is found at tables. In the ancient Near East, a table was more than just a place to gather. It was the central place for a communal people. It was the place that reminded them that they were in fellowship with one another, that they belonged to a particular people in a particular place in time. The table was where you would extend invitations, where families were reconciled, where friends were restored, where communities were built. It was the place that you belong if you had a table. And here we have Levi, the tax collector, who has a chance encounter with Jesus, and what we find ever so quickly and beautifully is that everything changes when you have an encounter with Jesus. Jesus asks him to follow him. Levi immediately follows him, but then Levi does what he only knows how to do. He throws a great feast, a banquet with a large table, and he invites his friends to gather at this table, and who is at this table? Jesus says yes. Almost reminding us that Jesus will go anywhere you invite him to go if the table is set. So we find Jesus at this table, reclining, it says, at the table. Not there judging, not there standing on the cool wall, but reclining at the table, laughing, telling stories. And what is Jesus doing at the table? He's not doing anything special. He's doing what he does wherever he goes. He is teaching them about the goodness and the grace that is the kingdom. There in Levi's house, in this banquet, the kingdom of God arrives in this place with sinners and tax collectors. Jesus teaching them not the good advice of the kingdom, but the good news that those who are far from God can be invited into his grace, that you can experience the grace of Jesus for any portion or any way that you are walking in this journey. And I would contend in a room this size, where there is nowhere to sit right now, and for those who are listening and watching online, that what we most need in this life is an encounter at the table with Jesus where there is grace, because God knows we need grace for the journey. You need grace in your season of marriage. You need grace in the season of parenting, no matter how old or young your children might be. You need grace in your career. You need grace with the things you are struggling with. You need grace in the doubts that you are wrestling through. You need grace in your body that is failing you. You need grace in the relationships that are broken. You need grace for the anger that you are feeling, grace for the vengeance that you are feeling, grace for the loneliness that you are feeling. We need grace. And what we see on this story, what we see in the story leaping off the page, if you would find yourself there, is you see this collision of two worlds. There in the same room, at the same table, you find the sick with the one who heals. You find the lost with the one who has been sent to find. You find the kingdom of darkness, a world full of greed, a world full of self-righteousness, a world full of self-provision, colliding with the kingdom of light, the kingdom of love, and the kingdom of grace. There at the same table, you find sinner and Savior alike. Almost as if Jesus is saying, grace is for everyone and anyone who is willing to sit at the table. And there is Jesus reclining at the table. The imagery is quite beautiful. There is Jesus interacting with the people, telling stories and laughing, and Levi's children are coming. He says, come sit next to me. Share this bread with me. Tell me about your father. Levi, tell me about your children. Tell me about your friends. Where did you meet? How long do you know each other? His disciples learning from him as Jesus is in this room with the city's most notorious and scandalous people. We find Jesus reclining at the table, offering them what the New Testament would call koinonia. It's the word for fellowship. And this isn't some sort of pseudo-friendship that's built on commonality. This isn't the kind of friendship that is built on sensibility and reciprocity. I will be your friend because you can give to me, and you'll be my friend because I can give to you. This is not the kind of friendship that just hangs in the balance because of mutual understanding or similar hobbies. This is Jesus extending to them himself, saying you can enter into this, the deepest of all communions, to commune with Jesus, not just in proximity, church, but in intimacy. Jesus offering his grace to the most scandalous of all people. Now, this doesn't quite sit well with everyone in attendance. There seem to be some Pharisees and some scribes who are not at the party, but they are watching the party unfold. The scribes and Pharisees would have never found themselves at that party. Even if they were invited, they would not go. Now you have to ask yourself, how did they even see what's happening in the party? In the ancient Near East, when people would throw parties, they would more than likely have them outside because of the number of people that would be there. And they would set long tables. You didn't sit at the table, you would sit on the floor, reclining at the table. But there was an invisible line around the home or the property where if you were not invited, you would have to stand and watch other people party. So you would have the poor, you would have the scribes, the Pharisees, those who were not invited, standing behind this makeshift line, watching other people party, and you think to yourself, how idiotic is that kind of life to watch other people party? We do the same thing, we just do it through television screens. You weren't invited to the Grammy party, but you definitely watch it. You weren't invited to the Oscars, but you definitely watch it. You weren't invited to the Kardashians, but you will tune in every 5 seconds. You weren't invited to Harry and Meghan Markle's anything, but you got their whole life memorized as you sit back behind the line watching other people party. And so there are the Pharisees behind the line. They would not dare cross the line. They would not dare be in the same proximity as those who were unclean or those who were unrighteous. So there they are standing. So they don't actually get to Jesus, but they somehow get the attention of Jesus' disciples. And they say, hey, why do you and the so-called Messiah eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Now, you can fill in the blank for whatever it is that would be for you. Hey, why does Jesus eat with Democrats? Hey, why does Jesus eat with Republicans? Why does Jesus eat with illegal immigrants? Doesn't he know they're refugees? And Jesus says, didn't you know I was one too? Hey, why do you eat with the Blue Lives Matter people? Why do you eat with the Black Lives Matter people? And the one I'm most confused about is, Jesus, why do you eat with Green Bay Packer fans? We all have our version of this, as if to say what the Pharisees are saying. Jesus, how did we find you here? See, the Pharisees were looking for a Messiah. But the Messiah they were looking for was the kind of Messiah that would come in glory, in military strength, to demolish the oppression of the Romans and give back God's people their promised land and establish the glory of Israel once more. That was their expectation. What they did not expect is that God came not to give us glory, but to give us his grace. I wonder if the reason we don't find Jesus in our lives is because we're too busy looking for him in the places we expect him to be. More than likely, the places that we expect God will give us more glory. We expect to find Jesus in the place where my business would increase. We expect to find Jesus in the place where my marriage would be a little bit more comfortable than it is. We expect to find Jesus in the school district that is good, because y'all know this is coming, because the devil only goes to bad districts, apparently. So we're only looking for Jesus in the places that we are expecting him to be, meanwhile missing the grace that he actually came to deliver. The Gospel of Luke refers to Jesus as the Son of Man 3 times. 2 times he is referred to, or 2 different ways, is the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. The other is that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So right then and there, Luke wants you to know the purpose that Jesus came. If you are wondering why Jesus came, if you are ever in the position where you are asking yourself that question, why did Jesus come? Well, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Those who are wandering in the depths of their sin, those who continue to push and reject God, those who find themselves in places far from God, lost from him, Jesus came on a rescue mission to find them. And the way that he finds them is not to enter this world and demand that he be served, although he would be rightfully do that, but rather he came to serve. Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, the one who was there when the world was created, the one whom, according to Colossians, is preeminent over all things, and he holds all things visible and invisible in the palm of his hand, who, according to Hebrews, is the radiance of the image of God, the exact imprint of his nature, came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life on the cross, that you and I, who are far from God, who doubt God, who hate God, who reject God, who are apathetic towards God, who want nothing to do with God, could find in God everything we are looking for. And what we are looking for is someone to give us the grace of life. And he says this is what he came to do. But the third Son of Man is rather interesting. The third Son of Man is that the Son of Man came eating and drinking. Eating and drinking. Now, in the one sense, Luke wants us to be reminded that Jesus, though fully God, was fully human. He had to eat. He had to drink. But there's something far more important that Luke is telling us here. He's telling us that eating and drinking was not merely a necessity for the Son of Man. It was, watch this, his strategy. It's the way that he moved towards people. By eating and drinking. I've always told myself that if you can cook, you can always have friends. You know, if you're a musician and you got friends like, hey man, come support my show. Like, okay man, I'll come support your show a couple of times. Eventually you're like, bro, I don't like your music. I'm not coming anymore. If you're a painter and an artist, like, hey, come to my gallery. Okay, I'll come to your gallery. $600 for this. Okay, I'm your friend. Can I get a payment plan or something? But eventually, you're not going to your friend's art show anymore. But if your friend can cook, and your friend says, hey man, I'm making a meal, I'll be there. I'll be right there. Jesus' most obvious strategy is that humans need to eat. I'll meet them there. You gotta eat. I'm just gonna show up at a table. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, 9 times we see Jesus eating or drinking at a table. Theologian Robert Caro says that in the Gospel of Luke, you either find Jesus going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. And what is Jesus doing at this meal? He is extending to anyone there the grace of God. It's almost as if Luke wants to make it obvious that the table is the visible sign of God's message and his mission to the world. See, there was a day where if you wanted to meet with God, you had to go to a prophet. And the prophet, say in this case, was Moses. Moses would speak to the people on behalf of God. So Moses would climb up Mount Sinai, and there God would set a table, an extravagant, beautiful, glorious table for two, God, the I Am, and Moses. And there Moses would meet with God, and then he would get from God what God wanted to say to the people, and then he would trek down the mountain and deliver the message to the people. But in the New Testament, we see that God himself leaves the mountain, and he comes down to be with the people. God with us. You can dig and search and study every faith in the human story, and you will not find one other than the message of Jesus, where God comes down to his people to be God with us. His message of grace and his mission to invite us into that grace. And if you want to find Jesus this year, and I'm contending that you do, maybe you don't think you do, but the communion that Jesus offers you is an invitation that your soul knows you were designed for. And so whether you know it or not, you are born looking to find God. And if you want to find Jesus this year, I want to give you two things, then we'll end our time together in communion. If you were to find Jesus at the table, you must know that you are invited to embrace God's grace. Darrell Johnson, he says, the truest thing I know is that at the center of the universe is a relationship that I'm invited into. At the center of the cosmos is a profound and eternal and glorious relationship. God the Father in love with God the Son in love with God the Spirit in love with God the Father, moving together in one beautiful dance that you and I are invited into. Now Levi throws a party, but Jesus set the table. Jesus sets this table with Levi and all of his friends, and he says, Levi, there is a relationship that has existed in the universe far before you even were a thought, and now I'm inviting you into that relationship where there will be communion forever. There will be a grace that you experience forever. You know what the number one critique of Jesus was? The number one critique of Jesus, you read it throughout the Gospels over and over and over again. The number one critique of Jesus was this: he eats and he dines with sinners. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Now, mind you, Jesus was not a glutton and he was not a drunkard, because to be a drunkard would be to live in sin, and Jesus did not live in sin. Jesus was not at parties, stuffing his face, walking around with a little plate, handing out shots to people. That's not what Jesus was doing. Because in the midst of that critique, that look at this man, this so-called Son of Man, Son of God, who eats and he drinks with sinners, in the midst of that critique, they weren't actually listening to the words of Jesus, who says, I have come to call sinners, not the righteous. And who are the righteous that Jesus is speaking about? The righteous is anyone who only trusts in themselves and their own performance, however religious it might be, for their salvation. Or a righteous person is one who does not see salvation as necessary. Now, of course, you and I would never say that we are righteous people or self-righteous people. Now, I have never seen the stand-up by a guy named Jeff Foxworthy. My wife tells me about these things, and she says that he has this stand-up called You Might Be a Redneck If. Now, just so you know, before I said redneck, I cleared it with Pastor Trevor, who speaks on behalf of all white people here. And he said I could say the word redneck. I don't know if I've ever seen a redneck or ran across one. I don't really understand the jokes. I saw one the other day where he said, you might be a redneck if when the offering plate goes by, you look for change. I don't get it. I don't understand that one. Just sounds like a frugal guy to me. I don't understand that one. But I thought to myself, well, you might be righteous if. You might be righteous if you compare your spirituality to someone else's. You might be righteous if you justify your disobedience. You might be righteous if you go a full 24 hours without a single confession to God. You might be self-righteous. Parents, you might be self-righteous if you've never had to, with your own child in audience, confront your own hypocrisy. You might be self-righteous. And Jesus says, I have not come to call those who deem themselves unnecessary for salvation. I've come to call those who know they need to be saved. This entire story begins with a call. Levi, follow me. And immediately, Levi leaves everything. I mean, Luke wants to make it clear. He leaves everything, not just some things. Jesus, I will follow you most of the way, but just so you know, Jesus, I'm gonna hold on to the playoffs because it's playoff time and I gotta orient my life around this. Jesus, I'll follow you with my prayer and I'll follow you with my time, but my money, I'm gonna have to hold on to that one. My children, I know you spoke the world into motion. I know you laid the foundations of this world, but Jesus, I don't know if you know the condition of parenting these days. So let me take care of the kids. Let me take care of the wife, and let me take care of school and the home and ambition and unforgiveness and healing. Let me take care of all that, and whatever's left, I'll give you that. But Jesus says, follow me. Jesus is saying the invitation is all of you must follow all of me, which means Jesus is the one who directs your life, directs your decisions, directs where you go, which means then Jesus is the one who offers you what you need. What is Levi following Jesus for? 10 steps to a better marriage? Is that what he's following Jesus for? 5 steps to how to use finances better? Is that what he's following Jesus for? The 2 steps for a better life, is that what I'm following Jesus for? No, he's following Jesus because his soul is longing for the one thing he realized in that moment only Jesus can give him: grace for the journey. I need your grace. And at that table, Jesus sets the stage for grace for him. And here's what I have found in my life. I have found that people love the verse that Jesus came eating and drinking, because that verse allows us to justify and abuse grace so that we don't have to change. But have you noticed, Jesus never celebrated sin. He never said, I know you were born this way. I know you can't help it. And I know the world's different now. We've changed contextually, so we got to change the word a little bit to fit the culture that we're in. Hey, listen, I affirm you. I celebrate you. I advance you. Whatever you want to do, I'm good with it. Jesus never says that. But time and time again, though he ate with sinners and drank with sinners, he would tell them, now go and sin no more. He would call them to repentance, to turn from sin, to turn from our own way, to turn from our rejection of God, and to turn to grace. Friends, grace is not an excuse to stay as you are. Grace is the power of God to change you into who he has designed you to be, to transform you into who God has called you to be. And this is what the sinners and the tax collectors find. They find in Jesus the power to change. This is the table, friends, that you are invited into. The table that calls you to turn, the table that calls you to transform, to change in his presence, to experience what? Healing. Healing. Because the implication is here that every one of us is looking for a table. Jesus' words, follow me, are not some profound words that no one's ever used before. Every rabbi used that word, follow me. In fact, every corporation uses that word, follow me. Every influencer today uses that word, follow me. So we are, from birth, looking for a table to sit at. And the reason that you give into your sexuality is because you are begging for a table where you can belong. The reason that you will fight everyone around you, young man, to get to that corporate suite is because something about that suite gives you a sense of identity. So I will do whatever it takes to get to that table. The reason we hold on to our frustrations and our anger and our vengeance and our need for revenge and betrayal is because that's a table that we know. And that's a table I'm willing to sit at, regardless of the cost. I'll sit here at this table. We're all sitting at a table. But the table of Jesus, it flips everything upside down. Levi knows that he is a man that needs to be saved. In fact, Levi, he knows that he's hated. In order to become a tax collector, it wasn't just something you signed up for as a kid. When I grow up, I'd like to be a tax collector. No one said that then, and I'm pretty sure no one says that now. It's a job you just end up with. But to be a tax collector, you had to buy a particular franchise of the Roman taxes in a particular region. But it's quite expensive to buy the franchise. So the way that you would buy the franchise is you would have to sell your birthright, your land. And for Jewish people, their land was their promise. So Levi had to sell his land, sell his birthright. He had to turn his back on his people, reject God, because now as a tax collector, he could never be allowed in the temple. He knew he was hated. He knew he was far from God. He knew that he needed God. And in that moment, with sinners all around, sinners like us, who know we need God, they experience what Rosario Butterfield will call a contagion of grace. A grace that turns everything upside down. Everything upside down so that you could find no more excuses, but freedom and healing. I have come to heal those who are sick. Healing from what, friends? Healing from the sin that so easily entangles us. Healing from the need to prove yourself. How many of you in here right now could use healing from the need to constantly prove yourself to others? Healing from the need to justify your sin. Healing from the unforgiveness that is crippling and tearing your soul apart. Healing from broken families. Healing from loneliness. Healing from loss. Healing from anxiety. Healing from death. Healing from the agreements you have made and the attachments that you have formed. Healing is what he offers you, and he offers you grace for the journey in that healing. This year, if you want to find Jesus, you are going to have to sit and stay and remain at the table. You are going to have to sit and remain and stay in his word and in prayer and in worship and here with God's people. You are going to have to sit at the table of worship, sit at the table of confession, sit at the table of forgiveness and experience the radical, eternal, unending, immovable grace for the journey. Yeah. But it gets a little bit better, because not only are we invited to experience God's grace, but to be participants in that grace. See, it's one thing to find grace at the table, God's grace at the table, but to find Jesus, we are also invited to extend God's grace at the table. Church, the surest sign that you have been touched by God's grace is that you are willing to freely extend it. If God's grace has actually touched you, then you have no problem extending that grace. Levi follows Jesus with everything. Some of you remember that day, don't you? When the Spirit of God fell and activated something in your heart, and all you wanted to do was follow Jesus. Come on, don't you miss that day. And you gave everything to him, and what does Levi do right away? The only thing, he only knows how to do things, apparently, 2 things, take your taxes and throw a party. That's all he knows how to do. So he throws a party, and who does he invite? People like him. He doesn't know any good Christians yet. He hasn't been to Church 101 yet. He hasn't gone to Welcome to Church yet. He doesn't know anything about church etiquette yet. He hasn't signed up for a small group yet. He hasn't gone to a conference yet. He has never listened to a Dove Award-winning artist in his life yet. He doesn't know what he's doing. He just knows, I met Jesus. I want my friends to meet Jesus, so I'm gonna throw a party because people know I can throw a party. So he throws a party and he invites sinners and tax collectors. And what I found so interesting is that so many of us who follow Jesus, we start to create these little, what I would call holy huddles. And we create these little pockets and circles like, shh, man, shh. Don't let nobody near our grace. Martha, don't tell them about the grace that we got. I don't know why it sounds Southern, but it always does in my mind. Maybe it could be Scottish. Let's try Scottish. Don't let anyone near the grace that we've got here. This grace is for us and us only. Yes, my name is Sean Connery, and I don't share my grace with anyone. Remember that song? If you grew up in the church, we used to sing this little song. It was this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Except today, it's this little light of mine, I'm gonna give it to myself. No, nobody. It's like Schmeagol from Lord of the Rings. Like, it's mine, the precious is mine. And when we do that, we miss participating in the grace that God has given us to extend. And if you want to experience Jesus in your life this year, you are going to have to make room at the table. See, the Pharisees had no problem with Jesus at a party. The Pharisees, in fact, knew that the kingdom of God, at the arrival of the Messiah, at the redemption of all things, that we don't just float up to heaven and become like naked baby angels with wings and shooting arrows, that we actually go from a garden in Genesis to a city and the kingdom of the feast, the banquet of the Lamb. And they knew this. In fact, Pharisees threw some of the best parties in their day, because they believed that their table was an extension of the kingdom to come. The only difference was they only invited people who were clean like them. So to be at the table of a Pharisee, you had to be ceremonially clean and follow all the righteous requirements of the law that God said, and they added, in order to be at that table. So the Pharisees had no problem with Jesus at a party. They just had a problem with the guest list. We just don't like who's invited to the party. And when you think of tables today, tables have a long and sordid history. Tables in history have been the place of division. What should be the place of intimacy and communion and friendship in history, in our history and in human history, the table has been the place, whether it's the school table, it's the cafeteria table, it's the restaurant table, or the table at your home, a place of division. No blacks allowed, no Irish, no Jews, no Chinese, no poor, no Dalit. Only people like us can come in. Martin Luther King once said that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. Whether that's true or not, I'm not quite sure, but I do believe that Sunday evening and Monday evening and Tuesday evening and Wednesday evening and Thursday evening and Friday evening and Saturday evening might be the most segregated hour in the world. Because we today have taken what God designed for intimacy and created an industry. The room of hospitality, the table in our homes that we spend so much money on. We buy magazines of how to make our room look better. We watch TV shows of how to make this dining room look better, yet no one ever sits in the dining room. It's an industry. Today, the table has become a place of injustice. In order for you and I to have the meals that we waste, The poor has to be exploited. In fact, a recent study suggests that American Christians, so this isn't just Americans, American Christians last year spent $50 billion on dieting. That is insanely more than American Christians gave to global missions. And much of global missions is giving the poor food and water. It's a place of individuality. What was once the communal central place of life, the most important room in your home is the table, has now become a place of individuality. People can come, yes, as long as they vote like you, and talk like you, and dress like you, and act like you, and think like you, and pray like you, and worship like you. And if we are to be faithful Christians, if we are to find Jesus, then we must be willing to reflect the same welcome that God has given us. In fact, studies would tell you, history would tell you, that in the first 4 centuries, the church exploded, not because of martyrdom, but because of basic hospitality. Opening your table to the church, to your neighbors, to the strangers, to the poor. That's how the church exploded. Church is actually not that complicated. It's not that complicated. You gotta eat. I gotta eat. It doesn't look like it, but I gotta eat. It's not complicated. It's not easy, because it's gonna cost you. It's gonna cost you time. It's gonna cost you to make some sacrifices. It's gonna cost you money. But it's not complicated. And I want to just encourage you in this place. There was a pastor who once said, when you're preaching to the church, there's always 3 people in audience: the critic, the cynic, and the committed. And he said, waste no time on the critic and the cynic, speak to the committed. So let me speak to the committed. Let me encourage you those of you who are doing this, you are opening your home and your table. You are making your table. Your children, your roommates, your family, your friends are seeing this table, and they are seeing the kingdom of God at that table. They are seeing forgiveness extended. They are seeing testimony shared. They are seeing the poor cared for. They are seeing the lonely brought in. They are seeing the afflicted healed. They are seeing this in your home. They are seeing neighbors who don't know Jesus sitting at the table with those who love Jesus. So keep doing it, because if the Son of Man came eating and drinking, friends, that's our strategy. What a great strategy for Christians. How are you going to reach people? Eating and drinking. Because if Jesus did it, then I'm going to do it. This is the way that we extend the kingdom. Because at that table, grace is for all people. Paul writes to the church in Ephesians 2, verse 4, but God, being rich in mercy, out of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved through faith. Grace for what? Grace from sin and into a life of fellowship with God. That's why this is the most important thing we do as a church. Because this says, lonely, you're welcome. Broken, you're welcome. Not even sure if I want to pursue Jesus right now, you're welcome. You have no idea what I did last night, you're welcome. You have no idea the anxiety that I'm battling just to be in this room, you're welcome. You have no idea the shame and the guilt that I am feeling over my life, you are welcome. Because here, Jesus is saying to you, this is God in heaven, the one who created everything, is saying to you, you can be in intimacy with me. Because every other person in life, we have to clean up just to be in proximity. And Jesus is saying, you don't have to clean up at all. You can come as you are, and you can let grace change you. So you want to experience Jesus in your life? Let me make this as practical as I can. Spend the rest of your life building longer tables instead of higher walls. build long tables. Start here, start with the church. Tozer says the easiest place to make disciples is the church. Look around. You don't know someone? Invite them to the table. You need to confess to someone? Invite them to the table. You need to share a story of your faith and what Jesus has done for you, how he's healed your marriage, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Set a table. Because there at the table, friends, the church is strengthened. People are reconciled. Gospel unity is formed. Discipleship is happening. Strangers become family. And grace is the thing that holds it all together. Grace for the journey. Grace for the journey. So I invite you now, 3 Sundays into the year. What if we could find Jesus this year? Jesus says in Revelation 3:20, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man, if any woman would open the door, I would come in with them, and I would dine with them, and they with me." This is your invitation to embrace the grace of heaven and to extend it for those who need his grace, grace for the journey at the table.